Imagine holding in your hands a book so dangerous, so controversial, that religious leaders buried it for over 2,000 years. A book that reveals the untold story of giants who once ruled our world and the terrifying reason why they had to be destroyed. What you're about to hear isn't from the Bible, you know. This is the story the Bible barely mentions. The complete, uncensored account of the Nephilim, told from their own perspective. When archaeologists discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, they found something that would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about ancient history. Among those crumbling manuscripts lay fragments of the Book of Giants, a text so explosive that it was deliberately excluded from Scripture. But why? What secrets did it contain that were too dangerous for human eyes? Picture this: you're a Bedouin shepherd in 1947, searching the rocky caves near the Dead Sea for a lost goat. You throw a stone into a dark cavern and hear the unmistakable crash of breaking pottery. Your heart races as you climb down into the cave, your torch revealing clay jars that have sat untouched for nearly 2,000 years. Inside those jars, wrapped in ancient linen, are scrolls that will rewrite history. But here's where it gets controversial. These weren't just any scrolls. Among them were pieces of a forbidden book that tells the story. Genesis only hints at the story of angels who came down from heaven, fell in love with human women, and created a race of giants whose existence nearly destroyed the world. Now, before we dive deeper into this rabbit hole, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about our ancient past. And let me know in the comments, do you believe giants once walked the earth? Your answer might surprise you by the end of this video. The Book of Giants isn't just mythology. It's a historical document that predates Jesus by centuries. It was read by Jewish communities, preserved by Persian merchants, and copied by monks across 3 continents. This wasn't some fringe belief. This was mainstream ancient thought that got buried by later religious authorities. But why bury it? What was so threatening about this ancient text? The answer lies in what it reveals about the nature of reality itself. This book suggests that our world has been shaped by beings from other realms, beings who crossed boundaries they were never meant to cross. It tells of knowledge that was stolen from heaven and given to humanity too soon. It speaks of creatures born from forbidden unions who grew so powerful they threatened the very fabric of creation. Think about this. Every ancient culture has stories of giants. The Greeks had their Titans, the Norse had their Jotuns, the Mesopotamians wrote of the Anunnaki, Native Americans tell of cannibalistic giants. Celtic legends speak of enormous beings from another world. Coincidence? Or fragments of a shared human memory? The Book of Giants suggests it's memory, racial memory of a time when colossal beings actually walked our Earth, ruled human civilizations, and ultimately brought about their own destruction through their insatiable appetites. But here's what makes this text truly controversial. It doesn't just tell us these giants existed. It tells us they're coming back. According to the prophecies contained within these ancient fragments, what happened before will happen again. The Watchers will descend. The boundaries between worlds will weaken, and once again, giants will walk among us. Jesus himself referenced this when he said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." But what exactly was happening in Noah's time that was so significant? The Book of Giants provides the answer, and it's more terrifying than you might imagine. You see, the flood wasn't just about human wickedness. It was about genetic contamination, about creatures that shouldn't exist, about knowledge that was corrupting the very essence of what it means to be human. And according to these ancient texts, it's happening again. Modern genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, the blurring of boundaries between human and machine, these aren't new concepts, they're ancient ones, playing out once more on the stage of history. The Book of Giants warns us that when these boundaries are crossed again, the consequences will be just as catastrophic as they were in Noah's time. But don't take my word for it. Let's journey together through this forbidden text and discover what really happened when heaven's watchers fell to earth, when giants ruled the world, and when the Creator himself decided that total annihilation was the only solution. Fair warning: what you're about to learn will change how you see the world around you. You'll start noticing connections between ancient prophecies and modern technology. You'll question whether the beings in UFO encounters might be the same entities our ancestors called angels and demons. You'll wonder if the archaeological evidence of enormous skeletons that keep disappearing from museums might be more than coincidence. The Book of Giants doesn't just tell us about the past, it reveals patterns that could predict our future. Are you ready to open this forbidden book? Are you prepared to learn the secrets that religious authorities thought were too dangerous to preserve? Then, let's begin our descent into the most controversial story ever told, the true history of when giants walked the earth. Long before humans learned to write, before the first cities rose from the earth, there existed beings of pure light and consciousness who dwelt in the highest heavens. They were called the Watchers, 200 angels assigned to observe the developing world from their celestial posts. But something went terribly wrong. Picture the scene. These immortal beings, perfect in knowledge and power, gazing down at the young Earth from their stations among the stars. Day after day, century after century, they watched as humanity began to flourish. They observed as humans laughed, cried, loved, and created. They witnessed the raw, passionate intensity of mortal life, something they had never experienced. And slowly, impossibly, they began to feel envy. Now here's where the story gets controversial. Were these angels simply curious observers who made a tragic mistake? Or were they part of a calculated rebellion against the divine order? The Book of Giants suggests it was both and neither. Their leader was Samyaza, an archangel whose very name meant the Watcher of God. He was joined by beings whose names still echo through occult traditions: Azazel, Barakel, Kokabeel, Raguel, and 195 others. Each possessed specific knowledge of cosmic mysteries, the secrets of stars, weather, metals, plants, and the fundamental forces that govern reality. For millennia, they maintained their posts, but as they watched humanity develop, something unprecedented happened to these perfect beings. They began to change. It started with fascination. These immortal entities, who had never known physical sensation, became captivated by human beauty, particularly the grace and allure of mortal women. They observed human romance, passion, and physical love with growing desire for something they had never experienced. But here's the disturbing question that the Book of Giants forces us to confront. If these beings were perfect and incapable of sin, how could they fall? What does their rebellion tell us about the nature of free will, even in heaven? The text suggests that their fall wasn't sudden, but gradual, a slow corruption that began with a single, forbidden thought. What if we could experience life as humans do? This is where the story becomes a mirror for our own age. Just as the Watchers possessed knowledge and power beyond human comprehension, we today wield technologies our ancestors could never have imagined. And just like the Watchers, we're constantly tempted to cross boundaries simply because we can. The moment of decision came when Samyaza gathered his fellow Watchers on Mount Hermon, that mysterious peak where heaven and earth seemed to touch. Standing among the clouds, these beings of light made a pact bound by terrible oaths. "Let us all swear an oath," Samyaza declared, "and bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing." They knew what they were contemplating was cosmic treason. They understood the consequences would be severe, but desire had overcome wisdom, and curiosity had defeated obedience. Think about that for a moment. These weren't ignorant beings making a mistake. These were entities with perfect knowledge, fully aware of what they were about to do and what it would cost. Yet they chose rebellion anyway. What does that tell us about the nature of evil? About the price of forbidden knowledge? About the danger of crossing boundaries simply because we have the power to do so? Their descent is described in the Book of Giants as stars falling from heaven, not metaphorically, but literally. Beings of pure energy taking on physical form, abandoning their celestial nature to experience mortality. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. They didn't come alone. As these 200 Watchers descended to Earth, they brought with them knowledge that humanity wasn't ready to receive. Azazel taught humans the forging of weapons and the arts of war. Semjaza revealed the secrets of enchantments and root cutting. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabil taught the constellations. Overnight, human civilization leaped forward by thousands of years. Technologies that should have developed gradually over millennia suddenly appeared. Knowledge meant to unfold slowly through natural discovery was given in its fullness to beings, unprepared for its power. The results were catastrophic. If you're wondering whether this sounds familiar, you're not alone. Many researchers today point to our current technological revolution, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nuclear weapons, space travel, and ask whether we're repeating the same pattern. Are we, like the ancient humans, receiving knowledge we're not wise enough to use responsibly? But the Watchers' greatest transgression was yet to come. Having abandoned their heavenly nature and taken physical form, they did what they had descended to do. They chose wives from among the daughters of men. Now hit that like button if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, because what happens next is where this ancient story becomes terrifyingly relevant to our modern world. These weren't ordinary marriages. These were unions between beings of different natures, immortal and mortal, divine and human, celestial and terrestrial. The biological incompatibility alone should have made such unions impossible. But they weren't impossible. They were just unnatural. And from these unnatural unions came offspring that shouldn't have existed, creatures born from the violation of cosmic law itself. The children of these forbidden marriages would grow into beings of such power and appetite that they would threaten the very existence of life on Earth. They would become the Nephilim, the fallen ones, giants, whose very existence proved that some boundaries should never be crossed. As we face our own age of genetic manipulation and artificial intelligence, the question the Book of Giants forces us to ask is this: are there still boundaries that should never be crossed? And if we cross them anyway, will we face the same consequences as the Watchers? The answer, according to this ancient text, is as terrifying as it is certain. What happened before will happen again. The moment these hybrid children drew their first breath, the world changed forever. Picture this. In ancient birthing chambers across the earth, human women labored to bring forth beings that should never have existed. But these weren't normal births. These infants emerged from the womb already larger than full-grown men, their eyes gleaming with otherworldly intelligence, their cries shaking the very foundations of the houses that sheltered them. The Book of Giants calls them the Nephilim, a name that means the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. But their true nature was far more complex and terrifying than any single name could capture. These weren't the gentle giants of fairy tales. These were creatures born from cosmic violation, carrying within their DNA the conflict between two incompatible natures. Part divine, part human, fully belonging to neither realm, they were living contradictions that reality itself seemed to reject. Now here's what's truly controversial about this. According to the ancient texts, these beings weren't evil by choice. They were evil by nature. Their very existence was an affront to the natural order, and their actions flowed inevitably from what they were rather than what they chose to become. Think about the implications of that. If beings can be born inherently corrupt through no fault of their own, what does that say about free will? About justice? About the nature of good and evil itself? The giants grew at an impossible rate. While human children took years to reach maturity, these beings achieved adult size within months, and they didn't stop growing. Year after year, they continued to increase in height and bulk until they towered over both their human mothers and their watcher fathers. The Book of Giants describes some reaching heights of 30 cubits, that's over 40 feet tall. Imagine encountering such beings in person. Picture looking up at creatures whose heads disappeared into the clouds, whose footsteps shook the earth, whose shadows could cover entire villages. But their size was only the beginning of their strangeness. Ancient accounts describe them with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, echoing patterns that appear in archaeological discoveries to this day. Whenever giant skeletons are found, they often display exactly these characteristics before mysteriously disappearing from museums and universities. Coincidence? Or evidence that these ancient accounts were recording actual historical events? Their physical appearance marked them as abominations. Some had pale skin that never tanned, no matter how long they spent in sunlight. Others had hair in impossible colors, silver, blue, or deep red, that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Most disturbing were their eyes, which reflected light like animal eyes in darkness, marking them as creatures that belonged neither to the human nor the angelic realm. But the most terrifying feature mentioned repeatedly in ancient sources was their double row of teeth. Like sharks, they possessed multiple rows of razor-sharp teeth that allowed them to tear through flesh with horrifying efficiency. And they used those teeth often. You see, the giants were born with appetites that grew along with their bodies. At first, they consumed only plants, but not normally. They would devour entire fields in single meals, stripping regions bare of all vegetation. When plant life proved insufficient, they turned to animals, hunting the largest beasts to extinction across vast areas. And when animals became scarce, they did the unthinkable. They began eating humans. The Book of Giants describes scenes of horror that would make modern filmmakers blush. Villages fleeing in terror as giant footsteps approached, humans being devoured alive while they screamed, blood drunk from bowls. And eventually, when even human flesh became insufficient, the giants turned to consuming each other. But here's what makes this ancient account so disturbing. It doesn't present these acts as choices made by evil beings. It presents them as the inevitable result of what the giants were: creatures with divine appetites, trapped in physical bodies, forever hungry for something that didn't exist in the material world. The tragedy of the Nephilim wasn't just what they did to others. It was what they were to themselves, beings caught between two natures, powerful beyond measure, yet fundamentally incomplete, mighty but eternally unsatisfied. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like pure mythology, consider this. Every ancient culture on Earth has stories of cannibalistic giants. The Greeks spoke of titans who devoured their own children. Norse mythology tells of Jotuns who consumed everything in their path. Native American traditions describe Wendigos and other giant cannibals. African folklore speaks of massive man-eaters. Are these just coincidental myths? Or are they fragments of actual historical memory, preserved across cultures and continents? The Book of Giants suggests they're memories, racial memories of a time when such creatures actually walked the earth. But the physical horror was only part of the giants' nature. Despite their monstrous appetites, these beings possessed remarkable intelligence. They inherited the cosmic knowledge of their Watcher fathers and expanded upon it, developing technologies and arts previously unknown. They built massive structures using techniques that are still mysteries today. They composed music and poetry that could drive listeners to madness or ecstasy. They created systems of writing and mathematics that revealed the hidden patterns of reality itself. This intelligence made them natural rulers. They established themselves as god kings over human populations, demanding worship and tribute. Some ruled through pure terror, while others displayed a dark charisma that drew willing followers who genuinely believed these beings were divine. Under giant rule, human civilization achieved wonders, but at a cost that would ultimately prove too high to bear. Comment below. Do you think intelligence without wisdom is more dangerous than ignorance? Because what we're about to explore shows exactly why the answer matters more than you might think. Meet the individual giants whose names echo through ancient texts and whose actions shape the destiny of the prehistoric world. These weren't anonymous monsters, they were specific beings with distinct personalities, powers, and territories. And their stories reveal why their existence became an existential threat to life itself. The Book of Giants gives us intimate portraits of these beings, and what we discover challenges every assumption about good, evil, and the nature of existence itself. Let's start with Oya and Haya, the twin sons of Samyaza, the leader of the fallen Watchers. These brothers ruled vast territories in what we now call the Middle East, but their relationship was anything but simple sibling rivalry. Oya inherited his father's gift for understanding celestial movements. He could predict eclipses, comet arrivals, and stellar alignments with perfect accuracy. Ancient texts describe him standing on mountaintops, his massive form silhouetted against the stars, reading the future in patterns of light, invisible to human eyes. But Oya's knowledge came with a curse. He began experiencing prophetic dreams that showed his own destruction. Night after night, he witnessed visions of fire, flood, and judgment. These weren't metaphorical dreams, they were literal previews of his coming doom, complete with specific details about timing and method. Now here's what's controversial. Oya didn't deserve these visions. Unlike his actions, which flowed from his corrupted nature, these dreams were pure torture, divine warnings given to a being who had no power to change his fate. His brother Haya represented a different aspect of giant nature. Where Oya was contemplative and prophetic, Haya was a creature of action and violence. He mastered the secrets of metallurgy and weaponcraft that his grandfather Azazel had revealed, forging weapons from materials that shouldn't exist. Ancient texts describe swords that could cut through stone, armor that turned aside any earthly weapon, and tools that seemed to operate by principles unknown to human science. Haya's workshops became centers of technological advancement that leaped human development forward by millennia, but technology without wisdom proved catastrophic. Under Haya's influence, warfare evolved from simple combat to systematic destruction. He didn't just make better weapons, he created the concept of total war, teaching humans to fight not for territory or resources, but for the complete annihilation of their enemies. Then there was Mahaway, son of the Watcher Barakel. Unlike his cousins who ruled through strength or knowledge, Mahaway possessed the gift of supernatural travel. He could fly vast distances, his form changing as he moved through different realms of existence. This ability made him the messenger among the giants, carrying communications across continental distances in hours rather than months. But more importantly, it made him the one chosen to seek out humanity's greatest prophet when the dreams of doom became too terrifying to ignore. Which brings us to perhaps the most controversial figure in this entire narrative, Gilgamesh. Yes, that Gilgamesh, the hero of Mesopotamian epic poetry. But the Book of Giants presents him not as a heroic king, but as one of the Nephilim, a giant whose quest for immortality was driven by the terrible knowledge of his own approaching doom. This revelation explodes our understanding of ancient literature. If Gilgamesh was actually one of the giants described in the Book of Giants, then the world's oldest known epic isn't just mythology, it's a historical account of a being who actually existed, preserved through oral tradition and literary adaptation. Think about the implications. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes advanced technologies, supernatural abilities, and contact with divine beings. If its protagonist was actually a Nephilim, then these aren't mythological elements, they're historical records of capabilities that existed in the prehistoric world. But Gilgamesh's story in the Book of Giants differs significantly from the Mesopotamian version. Here, he's not a hero seeking adventure, he's a being tormented by the knowledge of his own nature, desperately searching for a way to escape the fate that awaits all giants. His friendship with Enkidu takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Two beings caught between worlds, neither fully human nor fully divine, finding in each other the only companionship that transcended their fundamental isolation. Now, let me ask you something that might make you uncomfortable. If these beings were born with corrupted natures through no choice of their own, were they truly evil? Or were they victims of their origins, deserving of pity rather than condemnation? The Book of Giants forces us to grapple with this question because it shows us giants who were capable of loyalty, friendship, and even love. They weren't mindless monsters, they were complex beings trapped by their own nature. Consider Asael, who became obsessed with understanding the patterns of creation itself. He spent centuries studying the fundamental forces of reality, trying to discover if there was some way to change what he was. His research led to breakthrough discoveries in mathematics, astronomy, and what we might today call theoretical physics. But every answer only led to the same conclusion: his nature was fixed, his fate sealed, his destruction inevitable. Or think about Batral, who attempted to use his inherited angelic knowledge to heal rather than harm. He developed medical techniques that could cure diseases instantly and repair injuries that should have been fatal. Yet his very presence corrupted everything he touched, turning his healing into another form of destruction. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, because these stories reveal truths about the nature of existence that most people never consider. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that the line between good and evil isn't always as clear as we pretend it, Island. The tragedy of the individual giants wasn't just their actions, it was their awareness. Unlike mindless beasts, they understood exactly what they were and what they were becoming. They watched themselves perpetrating atrocities while being powerless to stop. They experienced genuine emotions, love, friendship, hope, while knowing these feelings were doomed. This consciousness made their existence not just destructive, but tragic on a cosmic scale. By the time the giants reached full maturity, the world had become unrecognizable. What began as localized disruption had spread into global catastrophe, transforming the harmonious creation described in Genesis into a nightmare realm of ecological collapse, endless warfare, and systematic destruction. But here's what the traditional biblical narrative doesn't tell you. This wasn't just moral corruption. This was reality itself beginning to unravel. Picture the earth as it existed before the giants' rise. Ancient texts describe a world where the climate was perfectly stable, where plants grew to enormous sizes, where animals lived in harmony, and where natural disasters were unknown. The atmospheric conditions created by the waters above the firmament provided a greenhouse effect that made the entire planet a garden. Then the Watchers descended and taught forbidden knowledge. Overnight, human technology leaped forward by millennia. But knowledge given too soon, without the wisdom to use it responsibly, became a weapon of mass destruction. Under Azazel's tutelage, humans learned to forge metals that shouldn't exist. They created alloys using techniques that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. Archaeological evidence of impossible metalwork from prehistoric times, the Antikythera mechanism, the Delhi iron pillar, the precision-cut stones of ancient megaliths, these aren't mysteries. They're remnants of Watcher technology. But the giants didn't just inherit this knowledge, they expanded it. Haya's workshops produced weapons that could level mountains. Barakal's students learned to manipulate weather patterns, creating droughts and floods as weapons of war. Kokabil's astronomical knowledge was used to predict and enhance natural disasters. The result? The first global environmental crisis in human history. Forests disappeared almost overnight as giants consumed wood faster than it could grow. Entire species of animals vanished beneath their hunting pressure. The ecological balance that had sustained life for millennia collapsed within just a few generations. But the environmental destruction was only the beginning. As resources became scarce, competition between giant territories intensified. These weren't human conflicts fought with primitive weapons. These were wars between beings who could manipulate fundamental forces of nature. Ancient texts describe battles that split mountains, diverted rivers, and left scars on the landscape that remained visible for thousands of years. Some researchers suggest that certain mysterious geological formations from the Grand Canyon to the Sahara Desert might be remnants of these prehistoric wars. Think about that. What if some of our planet's most dramatic features aren't natural formations at all, but battlefields from an ancient war between giants? The human population caught in the middle faced extinction. Cities that had flourished under giant rule became death traps as their superhuman rulers turned against each other. Humans fled to mountains, deserts, and remote islands, trying to escape the violence consuming their world. But escape was impossible because the corruption went deeper than warfare. The Watchers hadn't just taught forbidden knowledge, they had performed forbidden experiments. Ancient texts hint at genetic manipulation that created hybrid creatures, mixing species in ways that violated natural law. The result was an ecosystem populated by monsters that belonged to no natural category. Greek mythology preserves fragments of these accounts: centaurs, chimeras, harpies, and dozens of other hybrid creatures weren't imagination. They were genetic memories of actual beings created through Watcher experimentation. These creatures added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish world. Humans found themselves prey not just to giants, but to ecosystems filled with predators that combined the worst characteristics of multiple species. The atmospheric conditions began changing as well. The protective canopy that had maintained perfect climate started breaking down under the stress of giant activities. Weather patterns became chaotic. Natural disasters increased in frequency and intensity. Some researchers suggest this is why ancient texts describe humans living for centuries before the flood, but much shorter lifespans afterward. The environmental conditions that supported extreme longevity were being systematically destroyed, but perhaps most disturbing was the psychological impact on the human survivors. Imagine living in a world where beings of godlike power could appear at any moment and destroy everything you've built, where the very ground beneath your feet might split open during battles between titans, where creatures from genetic experiments roamed the wilderness, hunting anything that moved. The trauma was generational. Children grew up never knowing safety, never experiencing the harmony their grandparents remembered. Human society developed survival mechanisms that prioritized immediate needs over long-term planning, cooperation over competition, hiding over building. This psychological scarring shaped human behavior in ways that echoed through subsequent history. The tendency toward warfare, the fear of the unknown, the suspicion of authority, these weren't inherent human traits. They were learned responses to surviving in a world ruled by monsters. Here's where the story becomes prophetic. Many researchers today point to similarities between the pre-flood world and our current situation. We're experiencing rapid technological advancement without corresponding wisdom. We're manipulating genetics and artificial intelligence without fully understanding the consequences. We're creating environmental crises through our appetites for consumption. Are we repeating the same patterns that led to global catastrophe in Noah's time? The Book of Giants suggests we are and warns us that the consequences will be just as severe. But the giants themselves were beginning to understand something terrifying. Their actions were accelerating their own doom. The environmental collapse they were causing threatened their own survival. The wars they fought were weakening all of them. The creatures they had created were turning against them. Most disturbing of all, they were starting to have dreams. Not ordinary dreams, but visions that came with the weight of absolute certainty. Dreams of judgment approaching, dreams of water rising, dreams of their own destruction. And these dreams were getting more specific, more urgent, and more terrifying with each passing night. Share this video if you think people need to understand how ancient warnings might apply to our modern world, because what happens next in our story shows exactly how those dreams of doom began coming true. The end began with dreams, not peaceful visions or wishful fantasies, but nightmares so vivid and terrifying that they shattered the sleep of beings who had never known fear. The giants, for all their power and knowledge, found themselves experiencing something completely foreign to their nature: helplessness in the face of inevitable doom. It started with Oya, son of Samyaza. As the giant who had inherited the greatest portion of his father's prophetic abilities, he was the first to see what was coming. Picture this massive being, 40 feet tall and strong enough to uproot mountains, lying in his bed trembling like a frightened child. In his dreams, he saw tablets of stone descending from heaven, inscribed with words of judgment. He watched as water began to seep from the ground, then pour from the sky in torrents that had never been seen before. But these weren't symbolic visions. They were precise previews of actual events, complete with timing, method, and devastating detail. The Book of Giants preserves Oya's own description of his first apocalyptic dream. I saw in my dream, and behold, the heaven was thrown down and removed, and it fell to the earth. And when it fell upon the earth, I saw how the earth was swallowed up into a great abyss, and the mountains were suspended over mountains, and hills were sinking down over hills, and high trees were torn away from their trunks, and were sinking and being submerged in the abyss. When Oya woke from this vision, something unprecedented happened. He wept. Think about that. A being of divine human hybrid nature, possessing power beyond human comprehension, reduced to tears by knowledge of his own approaching destruction. For the first time since their creation, the giants faced something their strength could not overcome, their knowledge could not prevent, and their status could not protect them from. The dreams spread to other giants. Haya began experiencing visions of cosmic fire consuming the earth. Mahawe saw himself falling from great heights, his ability to fly stripped away by divine command. Barakal's son dreamed of being bound in chains that burned but never consumed. Each dream was different in detail but identical in message. Judgment was coming, and nothing could stop it. But here's what makes these visions truly disturbing. They weren't sent to the giants as mercy or opportunity for repentance. They were given as psychological torture, forcing beings who lived in the present to experience their own destruction repeatedly, night after night, in perfect detail. The giants' reaction to these dreams reveals the complexity of their nature. Rather than responding with defiance or rage, they experienced genuine terror and desperate hope. They began seeking interpretation, clinging to the possibility that these visions might be symbolic rather than literal. This led to one of the most dramatic episodes in the Book of Giants. Mahaway's journey to find Enoch. Imagine the scene, the giants gathering in council, their massive forms creating shadows across entire valleys. The most powerful beings on Earth, rulers of kingdoms and masters of forbidden knowledge, reduced to desperate consultation about dreams they couldn't understand. They chose Mahaway for the mission because of his unique ability to travel vast distances through flight. But this wasn't ordinary flight. Ancient texts describe him transforming his physical form, becoming something between flesh and spirit that could cross continents in hours. His journey to find Enoch took him over territories devastated by giant warfare, through regions where their experiments had created monstrous hybrid creatures, across landscapes scarred by the environmental collapse their appetites had caused. For the first time, Mahaway saw the full scope of what the giants had done to the world. The flight gave him time to think, and thinking was dangerous for beings like the giants. Usually consumed by immediate appetites and desires, they rarely reflected on consequences or meaning. But alone in the sky, rushing toward what might be his people's only hope, Mahaway began to understand something terrible. They deserved what was coming. This realization that their dreams of doom might be justice rather than persecution transformed Mahaway's mission from desperate hope to resigned confirmation. By the time he reached Enoch, he wasn't seeking salvation anymore. He was seeking understanding. The meeting between Mahaway and Enoch represents one of the most dramatic contrasts in ancient literature. The giant, 40 feet tall and possessing strength that could reshape landscapes, standing before a normal-sized human whose only power lay in his connection to divine truth. Ancient texts describe Mahaway's approach. Mahaway came flying like the birds in order to bring the message to the holy ones. But when he found Enoch, something remarkable happened. The giant, who had never shown deference to any being except his watcher father, immediately recognized the prophet's spiritual authority. Here's what's controversial about this encounter. Enoch didn't treat Mahaway as a monster to be feared or condemned. Despite knowing exactly what the giants had done to the world, despite understanding the necessity of their destruction, Enoch showed compassion to this doomed being who had come seeking hope. The conversation between them reveals depths of meaning that scholars are still exploring. Mahaway presented not just his own dreams, but the collective visions of all the giants. He described their growing terror, their desperate search for meaning, their dawning awareness that their very existence might be a cosmic mistake. Enoch listened without judgment, then delivered the interpretation that confirmed their worst fears. But he didn't deliver it with cruelty or satisfaction. According to the text, Enoch's voice carried genuine sorrow as he explained that the dreams were divine warnings of coming judgment, that the flood would indeed come, and that no giant would survive it. Now here's where you need to like this video and share it with someone, because what Enoch revealed about the purpose of these dreams challenges everything we think understand about divine justice. The dreams weren't meant to offer escape. They were meant to provide time for the giants to confront what they had become and to choose how they would face their inevitable end. Some would choose defiance, others would choose despair, but a few would choose something else entirely, something that would echo through history long after the floodwaters receded. When Mahaway returned from his meeting with Enoch, he carried more than just an interpretation of the giants' dreams. He carried tablets inscribed with divine judgment, physical proof that their destruction was not only inevitable, but had already been decreed in heaven itself. The scene of his return must have been devastating to witness. Picture the most powerful beings on earth, gathered in their great assembly, waiting desperately for news that might offer them hope. Instead, Mahaway descended from the sky, carrying stone tablets that spelled out their doom in letters that seemed to burn with inner fire. But here's what makes this moment truly tragic. The giants didn't rage against the verdict. They didn't reject the message or attack the messenger. Instead, they did something that reveals the full complexity of their nature. They accepted it. The Book of Giants preserves their response. Then, all the giants and the monsters began to fear greatly, and they called Mahaway, and he came to them. And the giants entreated him and sent him to Enoch the scribe, saying to him, "Go for us to Enoch the scribe, and tell him that." But what could they tell him? What argument could beings who had consumed the world's resources, destroyed its ecological balance, and brought nothing but terror to human survivors possibly make for their continued existence? This is where Enoch's role becomes truly extraordinary. He agreed to do something that seems impossible. He would carry the giants' petition directly to the divine throne itself. Think about what this means. A mortal human, voluntarily ascending to the highest heaven to plead for beings whose very existence violated cosmic law. Not because he supported their cause, but because even the condemned deserve to have their case heard by the ultimate judge. Enoch's journey to heaven is described in terms that strain the limits of human language. He was transported beyond the physical realm, through layers of reality most humans cannot even imagine. Ancient texts describe him passing through 7 heavens, each more brilliant and terrible than the last. In the first heaven, he encountered angels who still maintained their proper stations, beings of light and music who had never fallen. Their reaction to Enoch's mission reveals the cosmic significance of what was happening. These perfect beings, who had witnessed the entire creation unfold, had never seen anything like the Watchers' rebellion and its consequences. In the second heaven, Enoch witnessed the imprisonment of some of the fallen Watchers. These weren't the leaders like Semyaza, but the followers who had been captured and bound immediately after their descent. Seeing their eternal torment gave Enoch a preview of what awaited all the rebels. The third heaven showed him the natural order as it was meant to be, creation functioning in perfect harmony without the corruption that had spread across earth. The contrast with the devastated world below made the necessity of judgment undeniably clear. But it was in the 7th heaven that Enoch reached the divine throne itself. The description of this encounter pushes language to its breaking point. Enoch found himself before a presence so overwhelming that most beings would have been instantly annihilated. Yet somehow, through divine protection, he was able to stand in that ultimate presence and present the giant's petition. Here's what's remarkable. The divine response wasn't immediate condemnation, it was patient explanation. Enoch was shown the full scope of what the Watchers' rebellion had unleashed. He saw how their teaching of forbidden knowledge had corrupted human development, leading to technologies that brought destruction rather than progress. He witnessed the genetic experiments that had created monsters, now terrorizing the earth. He observed the ecological collapse that threatened all life. Most importantly, he was shown the future, what would happen if the giants were allowed to continue existing. The vision revealed that the giants were not just destroying the current world, they were preventing the future from unfolding as it was meant to. Their continued existence would lead to the complete corruption of the human bloodline, the extinction of natural life, and ultimately, the failure of creation itself. But here's the controversial part. The divine response also revealed something else. The judgment coming upon the giants wasn't motivated by anger or vengeance. It was motivated by love. Love for the creation that was being destroyed, love for the humans who were suffering, and even love for the giants themselves. Because the judgment offered something the giants' continued existence could not, the possibility of redemption. Their destruction would cleanse the earth, allowing life to begin again. But more than that, it would free the giants themselves from natures that brought them nothing but suffering. Their physical death would end their eternal hunger, their cosmic isolation, their tragic existence as beings caught between worlds. When Enoch returned to Earth with this message, he faced perhaps the most difficult task of his entire prophetic career. He had to explain to desperate beings that their destruction was not only just, but merciful. The giants' reaction varied. Some, like Oya, received the news with resignation bordering on relief. Others, like Haya, responded with rage and defiance. A few, whose names the Book of Giants preserves, chose something unprecedented. They used their remaining time to try to undo some of the damage they had caused. These giants began teaching humans how to hide from the coming flood, how to preserve knowledge that would be beneficial rather than destructive, how to rebuild civilization after the waters receded. In their final months, they experienced something they had never known before, the satisfaction of creating rather than consuming. But perhaps most importantly, Enoch's journey established a precedent that would echo through all subsequent history. It demonstrated that even the most seemingly hopeless situations could be transformed through divine intervention, that judgment could be an act of mercy, and that redemption was possible even for beings who seemed beyond saving. Comment below, do you think mercy and justice can be the same thing? Because what happens next proves that sometimes destruction is the only path to restoration. The end came not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet arrival of 4 beings whose very presence made the earth tremble. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, the 4 archangels who had remained obedient while their brothers fell, descended to execute the judgment that had been decreed in heaven's highest courts. But this wasn't a vengeful act of divine wrath. What you're about to learn reveals the most profound truth about the nature of justice itself. Sometimes love requires the complete destruction of what exists to make way for what should be. The Book of Giants describes the archangel's arrival in terms that still send chills down the spine. And behold, 4 great archangels came to earth, and their appearance was more terrible than the appearance of the giants, and more beautiful than the appearance of the Watchers. Think about that description. More terrible than beings who could uproot mountains, yet more beautiful than the cosmic rebels who had once walked in heaven's light. These were entities that embodied the full, awesome power of uncorrupted divinity. Their first act was to confront the Watchers themselves. Samyaza, the leader who had initiated the entire catastrophe, was seized and bound with chains that existed outside normal reality. These weren't physical restraints, they were cosmic limitations that would prevent him from ever again influencing the material world. But here's what's truly disturbing about his punishment. He wasn't destroyed, he was preserved, fully conscious, to witness the consequences of his rebellion playing out through all of history. Every war, every injustice, every act of cruelty that could trace its origins back to the forbidden knowledge he had unleashed, he would experience as personal torment. Azazel, who had taught humans the arts of warfare and seduction, faced a different fate. He was cast into a desert place where he would remain until the final judgment, surrounded by sharp stones and rough terrain, experiencing the full weight of physical limitation he had helped impose on others. The other Watchers were scattered and bound according to their specific crimes. Each punishment was precisely tailored to their individual transgressions, creating a cosmic justice system that considered both the crime and the criminal's nature. But what about their giant offspring? This is where the account becomes almost unbearably tragic. The archangels approach the giants not as executioners approaching criminals, but as physicians approaching patients beyond cure. The text suggests that even these agents of divine justice felt sorrow for what had to be done. The giants' reactions varied dramatically. Oya, who had suffered through months of prophetic dreams, met his end with dignity and acceptance. Having seen his destruction countless times in visions, he faced the reality with something approaching relief. Haya chose defiance to the end, using his mastery of Watcher technology to battle the archangels themselves. Ancient texts describe a conflict that reshaped entire landscapes, as the giant who had mastered the secrets of metallurgy and warfare fought against beings of pure, divine power. The battle was never in doubt, but Haya's resistance revealed something important about the giant's nature. Even facing inevitable destruction, some retained the capacity for courage, determination, and the refusal to surrender, qualities that, in different circumstances, might have been admirable. Mahaway, the giant who had journeyed to find Enoch, chose yet another path. Rather than resist or submit, he used his final moments to try to preserve something valuable from the wreckage. He gathered human survivors, teaching them essential knowledge that would help them rebuild after the flood. In his last act, the giant who had been born from cosmic transgression became a savior of the very humans his kind had terrorized. But perhaps the most controversial fate was reserved for Gilgamesh. According to the Book of Giants, this legendary figure, who had spent his entire existence seeking immortality, finally achieved it, but not in the way he had hoped. Rather than gaining eternal life in his physical form, he was transformed into something else entirely, a keeper of memories, doomed to preserve the account of what had happened for future generations. This explains why the Epic of Gilgamesh survived when so many other accounts were lost. It wasn't just literature, it was testimony, preserved by supernatural means to serve as a warning for future ages. As the giants fell one by one, something unprecedented occurred. Their deaths released their spirits, but these spirits didn't ascend to heaven or descend to hell. Instead, they remained bound to the earth as wandering entities, what later traditions would call demons. Here's the controversial implication. Every supernatural evil that humans have encountered since the flood might be traced back to these wandering giant spirits. They retained their intelligence, their knowledge of forbidden arts, and their hunger for physical experience, but lost their ability to interact directly with the material world. This created a new form of temptation for humans. Rather than the direct teaching the Watchers had provided, these demon spirits could only influence and suggest, whispering forbidden knowledge to receptive minds, encouraging the same transgressions that had led to their own destruction. The environmental effects of the giants' destruction were immediate and dramatic. As these massive beings died, the ecological systems they had disrupted began to stabilize. Plants started growing normally again. Animal populations began recovering. The atmospheric conditions that had been thrown into chaos by their activities started returning to natural patterns. But the most significant change was in the spiritual atmosphere of the world itself. The oppressive presence that had weighed on all living things during the giants' reign suddenly lifted. For the first time in generations, humans could look at the sky without fear, walk in open spaces without terror, sleep through the night without nightmares. Yet, even as order was being restored, everyone could feel it. Something massive was still coming. The Archangel's work wasn't finished. They had eliminated the giants and bound the Watchers, but the fundamental problem remained. The world itself had been so thoroughly corrupted that only complete cleansing could restore it to its original purpose. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see how this ancient account might predict what's coming in our own time. Because what happened next set a precedent that the Book of Giants suggests will be repeated when corruption reaches similar levels again. The reign began gently. After all, the cosmic warfare, angelic interventions, and supernatural catastrophes that had marked the giants' destruction, the beginning of the actual flood seemed almost anticlimactic. Just soft drops falling from a sky that had been sealed for generations, touching earth that had never known precipitation. But the humans who had survived the giants' reign understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't weather, this was judgment in its final form. Noah had been building his ark for decades, following specifications that defied human understanding. The vessel he constructed wasn't just a boat, it was a floating ecosystem designed to preserve not just life, but the possibility of life itself. Here's what the Book of Giants reveals that the traditional biblical account only hints at. Noah wasn't just saving animals and his family, he was preserving the uncorrupted genetic heritage of creation itself. You see, the Watchers' experiments hadn't just created hybrid monsters. They had begun contaminating the DNA of normal creatures as well. By the time the flood came, finding animals that hadn't been touched by supernatural manipulation was becoming almost impossible. Noah's selection criteria weren't random. He was specifically choosing breeding pairs that retained their original genetic patterns, ensuring that the world after the flood would be populated by creatures as God had originally designed them, not as the Watchers had modified them. But as the rain continued to fall, something unprecedented began happening. The fountains of the great deep, mentioned in Genesis, started breaking open, releasing underground water sources that had been sealed since creation. Ancient texts describe these not as natural springs, but as cosmic reservoirs that had been held in place by divine command. When that command was lifted, water didn't just seep from the ground, it erupted with volcanic force, reshaping the landscape in hours rather than millennia. The Book of Giants preserves accounts of what happened to the surviving giants as the waters rose. Remember, some of these beings stood 40 feet tall or more. As the flood deepened, they retreated to higher ground, then to mountaintops, watching the world disappear beneath. Waves that had never existed before. Some giants used their supernatural strength to build rafts or temporary shelters, desperately trying to survive what they now understood was divine judgment rather than natural disaster. Others, accepting their fate, spent their final hours in ways that revealed the complexity of their nature. Barak, one of the giants whose name appears in multiple fragments, used his last days to carve warnings into stone messages for whatever civilization might arise after the waters receded. These warnings detailed the specific transgressions that had led to global destruction, hoping that future generations might avoid repeating the same mistakes. His carvings were discovered millennia later by ancient civilizations, who incorporated his warnings into their own mythologies. This is why cultures worldwide preserve nearly identical flood narratives. They weren't just oral traditions, but records based on actual stone evidence left by dying giants. Another giant, whose name is lost to history, spent his final weeks protecting a group of human survivors, using his massive body to shield them from the rising waters. When he finally succumbed, he had saved dozens of families who would never have survived without his protection. This act of selfless sacrifice by a being whose very existence had been deemed a cosmic mistake reveals something profound about the nature of redemption. Even creatures born from transgression retained the capacity for good, even when they could no longer escape the consequences of what they were. But perhaps the most disturbing account involves Og, a giant who some traditions claim actually survived the flood. According to certain texts, Og's enormous size allowed him to walk alongside Noah's Ark as it floated, using the vessel as support while the waters covered the earth. Other accounts suggest he clung to the Ark's exterior, sustained by food passed to him through a window. If true, this would mean that giant genetics survived the flood, explaining why biblical texts after the deluge continue to mention giants in various locations. The implication is terrifying. The purging wasn't complete, and the same problems that had necessitated global judgment would inevitably arise again. As the flood reached its peak, covering even the highest mountains, something remarkable happened to the spiritual atmosphere of the earth. The oppressive presence of the Watchers, which had weighed on creation for centuries, finally lifted completely. For the first time since the angels' descent, the earth was free from supernatural corruption. The air itself seemed cleaner, the water purer, the soil more fertile. Creation could finally begin to heal from the trauma inflicted by beings who had violated its fundamental order. But the healing came at an almost unimaginable cost. Entire civilizations disappeared beneath the waves. Technological achievements that had taken centuries to develop were lost forever. Art, literature, music, and knowledge vanished along with the beings who had created them. The Book of Giants suggests that we're still discovering remnants of pre-flood civilization in archaeological sites that conventional dating can't explain. Megalithic structures, impossible metalwork, astronomical alignments that demonstrate advanced knowledge. These aren't mysteries. They're echoes of a world that was deliberately erased. Yet even as the waters covered everything, Noah's Ark rode safely above the destruction, carrying within its walls not just the seeds of biological renewal, but the promise that creation could be restored to its original purpose. The flood lasted exactly as long as necessary, not one day more or less than required to cleanse the earth completely. When the waters finally began to recede, they revealed a world transformed, scarred by judgment, but purified for a new beginning. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that sometimes complete destruction is the only path to genuine restoration, because what emerged from those receding waters would set the stage for everything that followed, including the world we inhabit today. The Ark settled on Mount Ararat, and Noah opened the window he had sealed against judgment itself. But what emerged into the post-flood world wasn't just a handful of human survivors. It was the seed of every civilization that would follow, carrying within their memories the most important story ever told. Yet, here's what's truly remarkable. They forgot almost everything else, but they never forgot the giants. Every culture that emerged from Noah's descendants preserved some version of this story. The Greeks remembered them as titans who warred against the gods. The Norse recalled them as Jotuns from the world before Ragnarok. The Hindus preserved them as Asuras who battled the Devas. Native Americans, isolated from Old World contact for millennia, still told of cannibalistic giants who once ruled the earth. How is this possible unless these were actual memories rather than coincidental myths? The Book of Giants provides the answer. The story was meant to be remembered. It served as humanity's most crucial warning about the consequences of crossing boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. But memory is a fragile thing, and details get lost or distorted over time. What began as historical record gradually transformed into mythology, legend, and finally, dismissal. By our modern age, most people regard the giants as pure fantasy, no more real than dragons or unicorns. This transformation itself reveals something troubling about human nature, our tendency to forget the lessons of history, especially when those lessons challenge our current assumptions about what's possible. Consider this. We live in an age of unprecedented technological advancement. We're manipulating genes, creating artificial intelligence, extending human lifespan, and even attempting to merge human consciousness with machines. We're doing things that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. Sound familiar? The Book of Giants suggests we're repeating the same pattern that led to global catastrophe in Noah's time. Once again, we're receiving knowledge faster than we're gaining wisdom. Once again, we're crossing boundaries simply because we can. Once again, we're assuming that if something is technologically possible, it must be morally acceptable. The warnings embedded in this ancient text have never been more relevant, but there's another aspect of the giants' legacy that most people never consider: their spirits. Remember, when the giants died, their spirits didn't ascend to heaven or descend to hell. They remained bound to earth as wandering entities, retaining their intelligence and their hunger for physical experience, while losing their ability to interact directly with the material world. This created something entirely new in cosmic history: beings that existed between worlds, possessing supernatural knowledge but lacking physical form. They could influence but not control, suggest but not compel, tempt but not force. Every supernatural encounter humans have experienced since the flood, from ancient oracles to modern alien abductions, might be traced back to these wandering giant spirits, seeking some way to reconnect with physical reality. Think about the patterns. Entities claiming to possess advanced knowledge, offering technological secrets in exchange for worship or cooperation, promising to elevate humanity to godlike status while demanding the abandonment of moral restraints. These aren't new phenomena. They're the same temptations the Watchers offered, now being presented by the spirits of their giant offspring. The Book of Giants warns that these entities are growing more active as we approach what ancient texts call the time of the end. As our technology begins to mirror what existed in the pre-flood world, the barriers between dimensions are thinning once again. Modern reports of supernatural encounters increasingly involve beings offering advanced scientific knowledge, promising to help humanity transcend its limitations, or claiming to represent evolved versions of human consciousness. These aren't random coincidences, they're indicators that we're approaching another cosmic tipping point. The giant spirits are preparing for their return to physical form. But here's what gives me hope. The Book of Giants doesn't just warn about cyclic judgment, it also reveals the pattern of preservation. Just as Noah preserved life through the first global cleansing, the text suggests that preservation will come again when corruption reaches its previous levels. The question isn't whether judgment will come, it's whether we'll recognize the signs and position ourselves among the preserved rather than the destroyed. This is why understanding the Book of Giants isn't just academic exercise. It's practical preparation for challenges that may be much closer than we imagine. The text provides specific criteria for recognizing when corruption has reached critical levels. Widespread genetic manipulation, the creation of hybrid beings that violate natural law, technological advancement that serves destruction rather than creation, and the teaching of forbidden knowledge that humanity isn't ready to handle responsibly. Look around our current world and ask yourself, how many of these criteria are we already meeting? But the Book of Giants also reveals the most important truth of all. Individual choice matters, even when facing cosmic judgment. Remember Mahaway, who chose to use his final days helping humans rather than resisting his fate. Remember the unnamed giant who sacrificed his life protecting survivors. Remember Enoch, who risked everything to carry messages between worlds. These examples prove that even in the darkest times, even when facing inevitable judgment, we retain the power to choose how we'll face whatever comes. The giant's story doesn't end with their destruction, it continues through their influence on every generation that follows. Their choices echo through history, shaping our world in ways we're only beginning to understand. More importantly, our choices will echo just as powerfully into whatever world emerges from our current age. The Book of Giants asks us one final crucial question. When the next cosmic crisis arrives, and the text suggests it will, which side of the story will we be on? Will we be among those who learn from ancient warnings and position themselves for preservation? Or will we repeat the same mistakes that led to global catastrophe, trusting in our own power while ignoring the boundaries that exist for our protection? The choice is ours. The time to make it may be shorter than we think, but unlike the giants, who were trapped by their nature, we retain the freedom to choose our destiny. The question is, what will we choose?